Hello, everyone. My name is Chisa Lopez, and I'm the Executive Director of the New York State Youth Justice Institute. I want to start by expressing our gratitude to the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services, the New York State Office of Children and Family Services, the University at Albany, and the New York State Juvenile Justice Advisory Group for all of their support to the YJI. We're absolutely delighted to welcome you and Dr. Rick Rosenfeld to this session of our Lunch and Learn series. Like all of you, I am looking forward to Professor Rosenfeld's presentation on crime rates, social unrest, and the pandemic. Thank you for joining us today. A special shout out goes to Georgia Southern and to our partners across the New York State agencies who are here today. I am about to toss this over to our wonderful research assistant, Brian Rainey, who will go over a few housekeeping items and introduce Professor Rosenfeld properly. Take it away, Brian.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Youth Justice Institute Lunch and Learn webinar series. As Dr. Lopez said, my name is Brian Rainey, and I'm a graduate research assistant with the YJI. So the goals of this webinar are to, 1, act as a source for cutting-edge research on juvenile justice issues, 2, to provide information in an engaging and thought-provoking format, and 3, to bring together scholars and practitioners from various fields to explore the issues that we cover. And I have one housekeeping item in the calendar invitation email that was sent out on Monday and Friday and this morning. We included a link to a webpage showing how to access all of the features used today. So please reference this resource if you're having any technical issues. There will be points throughout the presentation today that are designated for answering audience questions, and we will have a Q&A portion at the end. So we ask that you put all of your questions for Dr. Rosenfeld into the Q&A section. Comments can be submitted into the chat. But before we begin in earnest, just to get everybody warmed up to the space here today, and since it is the first day of fall, I'd like to take a poll. So we're wondering, what is your favorite fall treat? This is just sort of a warm-up question to get everyone comfortable. So if you could go ahead and answer that really quickly. Okay, looks like people are answering pretty quickly. And votes are still coming in. And I will be closing it in just a moment. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the polling. And it seems like a New York favorite, apple cider donuts. That's people's favorite fall treat. So thank you for participating in that poll. And now that the housekeeping and poll is done, I think that we're ready to hear from a national expert in crime trends. Dr. Richard Rosenfeld is the Curator's Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Missouri St. Louis. His current research focuses on crime trends and the impact of policing on crime. He is a fellow and past president of the American Society of Criminology and the recipient of the Society's Sutherland Award. So, without further ado, Dr. Richard Rosenfeld.
Thank you, Brian, and hello, everyone. I'm glad to be joining you. I wish I were actually in Albany, but that's, we'll have to wait a bit for that. I used to live in Saratoga Springs, and I know the fall is just wonderful in your part of the country. So I wish I was there with you, but I'm only with you virtually. I'm going to talk today about some recent research I've done on changes in crime rates during the period of the social response to the pandemic. The study that I conducted looked at crimes in 11 different categories from the beginning of 2017 through the end of June 2020, this year. I've recently completed an analysis updating that study from the end of June through the end of August, and I'll give you a sense of what the updates indicate at the end of my presentation. So with that, let's get to it. Okay. So as I said, this study period is from January 17 through June 20. And I'm looking at weekly crime data from 27 up to, I should say, 27 large US cities during that period. 11 different crime types, including violent crimes, property crimes, and drug offenses. And as you'll see, as I show you some of the trend graphs, there's a vertical red line drawn in those graphs. And that vertical red line indicates a statistically significant change over time in crime rates, what are called structural breaks. And I'll explain those even further when we move forward. Somebody raised her hand. Okay.
Yeah, the YGI team can get to that, Rick.
Okay.
Great.
All right. So what we found in this study, and I should say, I conducted this study with Ernesto Lopez, who's a PhD student here at UMSL, and he did an absolutely spectacular job on this work. We found that property crimes decline. Generally speaking, from the 1st of March or mid-March through the end of June. So residential burglaries went down, larcenies went down, and drug offenses, interestingly, decreased during the pandemic. Burglary rates were down about 20%, and that 20% is from mid-March through the end of June. And that 20% drop is significantly greater than during the same period the previous year. Larcenies were down about the same, 17% from mid-March through the end of June. Again, statistically significant greater increase than during the previous year. And drug offenses were down a whopping 57% from March through the end of June in 2020. And that is a far greater decrease than we saw during that same period in 2019. I think that interpretations of these declines in property crimes and drug offenses are relatively straightforward. The period of interest here, certainly in March and April and through much of May, was a period of widespread quarantining. When people are at home, residential burglary tends to go down because burglars don't prefer occupied households to ply their trade. When businesses are closed, we have no shoplifting, and so larceny rates come down. And I think that the decline we see in drug offenses is reflective of police moving away, and this would be a longer term trend, moving away to some degree from enforcing street level drug crimes, especially associated with marijuana, and reduce street activity itself, which can depress the street level drug markets. So the explanations for the declines we see in property crime and drug offenses are relatively straightforward in my view. Here's an example of the larceny rate over time from January 17 through June 20. One thing I want to point out, this is a scatter plot of the weekly larceny rates. You see there's a very, very pronounced seasonality effect to the change in larceny, and that's really typical of most of the other crimes we'll look at. Overall, there was, some decline in larceny over time, but that really seems to be driven by the sharp decline we see as of March 2020. That's where that vertical red line is, suggesting that at that point, there's a statistically significant change in larceny rates, and it's, you don't need the red line to indicate that there is a big drop that begins in March and really persists through the end of June. Here are drug offenses. Again, some seasonality appears to be apparent, and there you see that big drop in drug offenses, beginning again in March of 2020 and persisting through the end of the study period. I should also call attention to the fact that there's a long-term decline in drug offenses. That's simply the linear slope, that black line that's trending down to the right. Drug offenses primarily become known to the police through police behavior, through police arrests. To some degree, people will call the police and to report drug selling on the street. But by and large, these offenses become known and recorded as offenses because the police take action. And I think what that overall downward trend suggests is the police are taking a little bit less action these days than they did some years ago. Having said that, however, there is that sharp decline we see during the pandemic period. The one exception to the decline in property crime is commercial burglary. Commercial burglary rates rose 200% in a single week in late May. That happened to be the week after George Floyd was killed. And it's really the week in late May and then in the first few days of June. That spike is very likely associated with the property damage and looting that occurred in some places at the beginning of the protests against police violence. And the spike ended as abruptly as it began. It was literally a one-week increase. There you see, at least I hope you do, that 1 week increase in late May. And so clearly there are many, many more breaking and entering to commercial premises going on during that week. But then you see the commercial burglary rate drop back to its, base or normal level. And that, I think, calls into question any claims that there was a continuing or persisting widespread looting and breaking and entering throughout the protest period. Really, that looting and breaking and entering was confined to a single week. And in the updated study that I mentioned at the beginning we're doing, we find this same pattern. We don't find any additional increase in commercial burglaries except for that single week in late May. A different story is associated with violent crimes. The violent crimes we're looking at are homicides, aggravated assaults, gun assaults, and also domestic violence. And we see increases in homicides, aggravated assaults, and gun assaults. Those increases, however, don't begin back in March when the social response to COVID was picking up, really beginning. They don't begin until that final week in May and the first few days in June in most of the cities we looked at. And that's the week after the George Floyd killing by police officers in Minneapolis. During that period, from the last week in May through the end of June, homicides went up 37% in our sample of cities. Aggravated assaults went up by 35%. And those are significantly greater increases than we saw during that same 5-week period the year before. In our analysis, we also saw a rise in gun assaults, but that increase was not significantly greater than in previous years. And I should indicate now that the equations that we estimated to produce those vertical red lines, those structural breaks, take into account That is, they control for the previous year's weekly crime rate, depending on the crime type. So when we see the appearance of that red line, that means that's a significantly greater change than what we saw during the same week the previous year. So gun assaults went up, but we can't distinguish that from a seasonal effect. Homicides and aggravated assaults, however, went up beyond what we would have expected based on the effect of the warmer weather, schools letting out in late spring and early summer. There's the aggravated assault rate. You see that pronounced seasonal character. The general pattern in aggravated assaults is relatively constant until we get to that structural break that occurs in late May, and then you see a very pronounced increase. I mentioned that we also looked at domestic violence. That increase in this study was not significantly greater than increases in domestic violence that occur at about the same time had occurred in previous years. Now, this result, out of the 27 cities we looked at, we could only obtain data for 13 of those cities. And so we should treat this result with some caution. Certainly, any increase in domestic violence or any sort of serious crime needs to be addressed, even if it's driven by seasonality factors. But for drawing causal inferences, I think it's quite important to distinguish these changes we've been looking at in recent crime rates from past changes. We don't want to mistakenly assign, say, to the COVID virus or something else, an increase in crime, when in fact we would have seen that increase in crime anyway, simply because of the changing of the seasons. So for drawing causal inferences and for policy purposes, it seems to me, we want to be careful to distinguish seasonality effects from other causes. There's the change in domestic violence. You see overall domestic violence rates increasing over time, but as I think this slide should make apparent, the increase we saw beginning in, roughly speaking, in March, the beginning of the response to the pandemic, is really no greater than we saw the previous year. And so the structural break in domestic violence actually occurred back in January of 2019. Okay, let me draw some conclusions. In my view, subduing the COVID-19 pandemic is a necessary condition for halting the rise in violence. Now, I didn't talk much about the pandemic as an explanation for the rise in violence. Keep in mind that rise in most of the cities we looked at didn't begin until late May or early June. But I do think the pandemic, and this is speculative, but I do think the pandemic is implicated in the rise, and specifically the impact of the pandemic on the response to crime by the police, but also by other groups in the community that can effectively address violence. The pandemic had an enormously important and continues to impact on police services and police departments. Officers are out on quarantine because they have the virus or have exposed to someone with the virus. And those officers who remain on the job are engaged in social distancing. And so the activities that officers engage in that can effectively address crime, including violent crime, are sharply reduced. I see that in detailed data in my own city of St. Louis, George Mason University, and the International Association of Chiefs and Police did a study in which they looked at survey data from police departments across the country, and they show sharp declines in police activity. But it's not just police activity that declined. It's responses to reports of domestic violence when people might visit the household or visit someone else in a face-to-face meeting. Those responses are down. Other community groups that can help to effectively reduce violence, their responses, which typically occur face-to-face, really can't be replaced by a Zoom. Those responses are down. So I think the pandemic is implicated in the rise in violence, and subduing the pandemic, returning to more or less normal conditions, will help reduce this rise in violence that we've seen. Now, having said that, I don't think subduing COVID is the only precondition for subduing the rise in violence. Recall that rise in violence coincided with the beginning of mass protests. And while I don't think there's any simple relationship, certainly, between the social unrest we've seen in many cities and the increase in violence, I do think there is a relationship. Again, one has to speculate. But one should ask, what happens to the communities in which the social unrest is centered, indeed, in which the police violence has been centered, and in which the violent crime increases have been concentrated? And what I think criminological research has shown us is that during periods of declining police legitimacy, sharply declining trust in, confidence in the police, a void opens up, or void widens in disadvantaged communities with high rates of violence in particular. That void separates community from the police, and that void is then filled, if it grows large enough, by street justice, people taking matters into their own hands to settle disputes, and that contributes to the rise in violence. I think that that has been happening during the recent rise in violence, just as it did, in my view, roughly 5 years ago, when we saw increases in homicide and other violence across the big cities in the United States after the events in Ferguson, Chicago, Baltimore, New York, and elsewhere. So one has to speculate about the possible relationship between protest activity, social unrest, and violence, but it seems to me those hypotheses are worth pursuing further. Finally, I think that the rise in violence may persist until both conditions on the street return, and for police agencies return to somewhat normal, and effective violence reduction strategies are coupled with needed reforms to policing. I'm not going to go into policing reform in any detail now. I'd be happy to discuss policing reform with you. But it seems to me reforms to policing have to be addressed, and they have to be addressed very quickly. And to the degree that cities are able to address those calls for reform by protesters, which is to say, to translate protest ideals into workable public or municipal policies. To the degree that that occurs, I think some of the damage to police-community relations can be repaired, and that may well contribute to a needed decline in violence. So I think effectively addressing the violence, the increase in violence we've seen, has to be coupled with needed reforms to policing. That's the conclusion to this study. Let me update it with two findings from our updated study, which extends the project period through the end of August. When we add additional data, we begin to see what appear to be some declines in violent crime. Recall those big peaks? Well, Depending on the city, mid to late July through the end of August, we see some drop. That drop, although it only occurs over a few weeks, and one has to be very careful about assigning too much importance to it, that drop is larger than what we saw during the corresponding period the previous year. So we see some relief, if you will, from the rise in homicide, the rise in aggravated assault, the rise in gun assault. Whether we're only looking at a few weeks extension here, and so we'll have to see. But to the degree that those drops are sustained, that would obviously be good news, and it could reflect the fact that policing and its effect on crime has returned to somewhat normal levels as our country has reopened, especially as of midsummer to late summer. One other updated finding has to do with domestic violence. When we add data through July and August, we now do find a significant increase in domestic violence beginning back in March through now the end of August. And that increase is significantly greater than the increase during the same period last year. But again, we have to be careful not to overinterpret that result because it's only based on 15 of the 27 cities we looked at. So that's my story. And now I'll give it back to Brian, who can take us into Q&A.
Thank you so much, Rick. Yeah, I just have some questions. So given the current social unrest and prior research, what recommendations do you have for policymakers in light of the quote unquote defund the police conversation that has become prevalent?
Okay, so let me expand a bit on what I think defund the police, that's not a term I would use. Reform the police certainly is a term I would use. I think the defund movement, what defund the police means depends on the speaker, really. But I do think it puts the cart before the horse a bit. We may end up defunding the police if that's what policing reform indicates with respect to revised budgeting for the police. But I don't think most places know what those revised budgets will look like yet. So what would police reform amount to? I think it's important to stay close to protester demands, and they seem to me to fall into two categories, or they're reflected in two themes. One is, and I think obvious, increase police accountability for police misconduct. So I mean by misconduct, and especially unwarranted police violence, I mean when an officer violates his or her training, violates his or her agency policy, not to mention violates criminal law, accountability for those violations, more certain and severe sanctions than we've seen, is certainly a good part of what the protest movement has suggested needs to happen, and I would agree. Now, how that comes about, what internal and external mechanisms are needed we need to strengthen in order to increase accountability, that becomes part of the tough policy process, but I think cities should begin experimenting with those mechanisms right now. Secondly, it seems to me the police reform movement has caused us to ask a very, very important foundational question. What is it that we want from our police departments, and what are they best able to provide? And what is it that we currently ask them or require them to do that they don't do a very good job at, or at least not as good as other agencies might do? Police, there may be some common ground between rank and file police officers and their union representatives and the protest movement, because rank and file officers are often heard to say, hey, we're not social workers. In other words, we're not prepared and trained to do the things the community has by default or design required us to do. We're not the best people to respond to the mental health issues of the homeless or to respond to drug overdoses for that matter. The fire department might be better to respond to drug overdoses because, a generation ago, the fire department moved into emergency medical services as the fire fighting became less and less a significant part of their business. The present fires on the West Coast, of course, being an important exception. So the basic issue here is, are we asking the police to do things that they themselves agree they're not prepared or trained to do? And wouldn't other agencies, social service agencies, perhaps even the fire department, other agencies, be better equipped to handle them so that the police could devote more time and attention to the functions that I think everyone, protester, police supporter, policymakers would agree are their essential functions? Addressing serious crime, certainly serious violent crime, but serious property crime as well. So that's where I would take the police reform movement with respect to policy.
Thank you. So what challenges does the pandemic present in terms of data collection and analysis of social and criminological phenomena?
Well, the big challenge is obtaining the data we need to make sense of whatever impact the COVID crisis might have had, whatever impact widespread unrest might have had on crime rates. As your audience, I'm sure, knows, we can't go to the Uniform Crime Reports and look up last month's crime rates for cities across the country. The year-end 2000 UCR hasn't yet, for the year 2019, hasn't yet come out. When it does come out, it's likely to show a continuing decline in violent crime when most people in the United States have been treated to news of a recent increase in violent crime. So we had to go from police department to police department, their websites, sometimes email or phone call contacts to obtain the data we needed. So that's a big challenge. There are no longer, and there haven't been for a long time, any technical impediments standing in the way of the UCR producing at least quarterly reports. And there's good evidence they're capable of doing that because back in the 1930s, the FBI did produce quarterly Uniform Crime Report data for the nation. Now, there were fewer police agencies during that time, but recall in the 1930s, those reports were filled out by agency personnel in pen and ink or on a manual typewriter and then sent by the local post office to Washington. All of that these days, particularly for the larger jurisdictions, is done digitally. So there are no technical impediments for why we could not have at least quarterly reports. And now, finally, I've been publicly hectoring the FBI and so have others about this. And I'm not claiming any credit for what the FBI really did. I'll give the credit to them. They did produce a semi-annual report for 2020, far earlier than in the past for their semi-annual reports, that do show an increase in violent crime during that period, decreases in property crime, much as we might have expected. Now, it's only based on 2/3 of the roughly 18,000 law enforcement agencies that typically report to the UCR, but 2/3, 67%, isn't bad. And it's up on their website. It takes a little digging to find it. Just go up in the FBI's Uniform Crime Report website, go to the Crime Explorer, and you can find for all the participating agencies in their cities, the 6-month change in crime during 2020. So good for the FBI. Let's hope they continue, move into quarterly reports. Indeed, I don't know why they couldn't do monthly reports, but so far so good with that.
So one thing that people keep bringing up or comparing the pandemic to is is the pandemic during 1918. So with that in mind, have we seen similar shifts in crime trends during other large-scale social changes like previous pandemics or the like?
I can't really, I don't know. I know generally speaking, in the mid to late 20s, crime rates were going up, violent crime rates, but so were property crime rates. So I can't really attribute those changes to the 1980 pandemic. Crime rates were increasing throughout the 20s, but I simply don't know. That's a great question about what impact. There's anybody who's out there and looking for a master's thesis or PhD topic, there would be a great one or a great research article. Anyway, yes, other momentous social changes do seem to be related to changes in crime rates. During the 1960s, the country underwent widespread, quite massive social unrest centered in the big cities around the civil rights movement, Black Power movement. Those instances of unrest were often sparked by conflicts between citizens, minority citizens typically, and the police. And we saw during that period, and of course that's not the only type of social unrest going on during the 60s, we saw the big crime rise in the US starting in the early to mid 60s and continuing with fits and starts through the end of the 70s. So there's one. 5 years ago, after Ferguson, there was a quite sharp increase in homicide, 11% in a single year, nationwide, something like 15 to 20% on average in the big cities. And that was a period of widespread social unrest. So yes, we've seen it before.
And we know that unemployment and the labor market have a complicated relationship with crime. So what sort of short and long-term impacts might the pandemic have on these, and by extension, crime trends?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as your question implies, the relationship between unemployment and crime, as all the criminology students out there should know, is far from a simple one. It appears to be a two-prong, if you will, two-component relationship. On the one hand, one can be reasonably certain that high levels of unemployment certainly increase the motivation for some in the population to commit crime. But at the same time that it increases the motivation for crime, it also very often reduces the opportunity to commit crime. Good example is home burglary, and this is one that's been featured in a lot of the research on unemployment and crime. Unemployment rates go up, the motivation to acquire goods illegally through burglary and acquire the income from those goods, that motivation certainly increases. But people are at home more often when they're unemployed. They act as guardians for their own households. And so while the motivation for burglary goes up, the opportunity for residential burglary would seem to decline. Those two effects can be counterbalancing, canceling one another out. And that's why I think we often don't see a relationship. And I certainly don't in my own research, and my research focuses on economic conditions in crime. We don't see a strong relationship between unemployment and crime. So what should we expect from the very sharp increase and scope of unemployment, joblessness during the current period? Very, very difficult to say. I would simply caution people not to jump to what appears to be the obvious conclusion that when unemployment goes up, of course there will be more crime. We did not see that during the Great Depression, interestingly enough. We did not see that during the 2008-2009 Great Recession. Unemployment spiked, and crime rates, some of you may recall, actually came down a bit. It's a tough, very complicated relationship.
Okay, so I think we'll go to some of the audience questions now. One attendee asked, some law enforcement bodies in New York City are saying that the uptick in violent crime is related to recent criminal justice reform, so raise the age and bail reform, as well as the push during the pandemic to decrease detention and jail populations. So how can we sort of combat those arguments?
Well, you should only combat them if they're false, right? And my own view is that the idea that bail reform in particular has led to an increase in crime is a case not yet proved. Fortunately, we have cities in our sample that have engaged in bail reform, such as New York City and a few others, along with cities that did not experience bail reform in any significant way. And we see increases in violent crime in both, right? And, you know, think of the people who typically are released from jail, either because of bail reform or for COVID-related reasons. They're not violent criminals by and large. Anecdotes would have one believe that, you know, violent criminals are being let out willy-nilly. Typically, they're property offenders. And if bail reform really did send crime rates up, we should see those increases, or should have, in property offenses. We haven't. Property crimes have been going down. So I'm not suggesting that bail reform might not have contributed in some places with respect to increases we've seen in some types of crime. I haven't seen good research. Maybe people in your audience have. I haven't yet seen systematic research on that relationship. So far, case not proved. And I think on a prima facie basis, that argument faces some pretty tough challenges.
So are the arrests in your study, or the data for it rather, are they arrests or reported crimes to these police departments?
With the exception, well, they're all reported crimes.
Mm-hmm. Right.
The exception is the one I mentioned, drug offenses, which technically is a reported crime, but usually produced as a reported crime because an arrest was made or police activity of some sort resulted in the agency recording that, you know, incident as a drug offense. But with that exception, these are all reported crimes.
And then one attendee said, it's interesting, we're hearing, one moment, I lost the question. Okay, I will get it back in a moment. But another attendee asked, how are the cities selected to provide the data, and was there any notable variations by density?
They were selected based on really two criteria. One is we wanted to limit our assessment to the larger cities, not because we're uninterested in what's happening in smaller cities or towns, simply because the larger cities tend to have larger and better resource police departments where we could obtain these data. And that's the second criterion, the major criterion. We went to those cities that had the data that we needed. We wanted weekly rates because these things changed. Think of the beginning of the COVID period on a weekly basis. And we wanted to go back to beginning of 2017. So we had a long pre-period against which we could compare these more recent changes. That sharply limited the cities. Now, let me give a shout out to David Abrams. He's at the law school and Wharton School at Penn. David has put up a really nice website. Just Google David Abrams. It'll take you right to his website. He uses, by and large, the same sample of cities that we do, even though we achieved our samples independently. That's pretty good. That's a pretty good check, kind of an inter-rater reliability check on the cities that have the data available. we by and large found the same cities. And Abrams has all kinds of good data up on his website. So I would recommend that you look at it. I should also make a pitch for the study I've been talking about. That's out and available. I think Brian has a copy of it, right?
Yes,
And,
I can distribute it.
Email Brian or however you want to deal with that, Brian. If people want the study to look at the results and the interpretations in greater detail, it's available.
And there are going to be 2 other iterations of that, or updates rather, correct?
Yes, one that should be out, if all goes well, mid next week, maybe late next week, around October 1. And a second will come out maybe a week after the election or early to mid-November. And that'll be that update will be an additional 2 months through the end of October. Will then come out in mid-January with a year-end 2020 report. Now, there was another part to the question that was asked, and did we see significant variation across the cities in these changes? With respect to property crime, really no. I think San Francisco, don't quote me on this, but I think it was San Francisco that didn't show a big decline in burglaries, at least at the beginning of the pandemic period, but with that exception. No, for the declines in property crime, they were really across the board. And interestingly enough, so were the rises in violent crime, though there was more variability there. One question that we didn't explore in any depth in this study, but may well in future work, is if there's some relationship between mass protest against police violence, a decline in police legitimacy, and an increase in community violence, it follows that we should see greater increases in community violence in those cities that had much larger and more persistent protests, right? Those data, the data on the number and size and persistence of the protests, those data are available primarily from press sources. And that's something we'll explore in future research. But we didn't look at that for the current studies.
Are there any cities in your sample that are also being impacted by other natural disasters, such as the hurricanes or the huge forest fires that are being seen out west?
Good question. Seattle is in our sample. San Francisco is in our sample. Portland is not. LA is in our sample. Now, for those cities, the impact of the fire, there has been an impact of the fires, but not as much certainly as in the city of Portland, which unfortunately is not in our sample. So I would say with respect to the fires, not really. The hurricanes have come along. Were there hurricanes, if the question is about the recent past, were there hurricanes back in August? I don't know. I think they've been pretty much confined to the beginning of September and moving forward. So, we have St. Petersburg in our sample. Unfortunately, we don't have Miami, and we don't have New Orleans. We have 27 cities. And so I can't really tell you about a possible connection with the hurricanes, both because I think the hurricanes have occurred since data collection ended at the end of August, but also because the cities that it might have affected, the hurricanes might have affected the most, were not in our sample, unfortunately.
So you mentioned that policing reforms need to be addressed and need to be addressed quickly.
Yeah.
And one of the recommendations you raised was that one needs to translate protest ideals into workable policies.
Yes.
So to your knowledge, are there successful examples of this translational effort?
Well, I think there are in other research areas. The one that comes immediately to mind is the research on targeted or so-called hotspot policing. And the subsequent, although it was really happening at the same time, the subsequent changes in, in enforcement practices. There's a case where the research informed the enforcement, and the revised enforcement in turn informed subsequent research. Now, I don't know, maybe members of your audience do know, but I don't know of a kind of similar marriage between research and policy in the case of at least the recent discussion of police reform. But there's no reason it can't happen, or it can't happen tomorrow or very soon in cities across the country. Cities don't have to wait for the federal government, don't have to wait for their own state governments, shouldn't wait until community groups push them. There are opportunities right now. Just give an example. I think opportunities come from research. Now, I'm not talking about highly sophisticated research of the sort that social scientists might do, although I think cities would benefit by consulting with local researchers. I simply mean a lot of natural experimentation. So let's take the example of calls for service because of reports of problems among the homeless, right? The first experimentation, do all of those calls need to come through 911, or can some of those calls, as has been suggested, be diverted to another service that would be responded to not by the police, but by a social service agency coordinator? How do we know which to divert? Well, how do we know which of those calls might or have a decent probability of being associated with violence that would require police response, certainly police backup? My sense is most of those calls don't have anything to do with violence and could be and should be handled by non-police personnel. But we don't know what the balance is, and there's a case for experimentation. Secondly, I don't think we need the police to monitor parking regulations, or, that is, blue-shirted, armed police officers to the degree they do to monitor parking regulations or to respond to drug overdose emergencies. Drug overdose emergencies typically are nonviolent, and the fire department is much better prepared to respond to medical emergencies, but other medical personnel may be as well. There's another case for experimentation. I claim most of those calls are calls for emergencies that carry no interpersonal violence, high probability. Maybe I'm wrong. There's a case for experimentation as well. Cities should be doing that right now. That's, it seemed to me, how you take a protest ideal and move it into kind of the policy research process and finally emerge with a policy that is workable because you've already tested it in a limited way.
So what are some recommended considerations or tactics for decision makers as communities grapple with closing schools or causing schools to go online, with the cold weather and the limited options for positive engagement with young people in terms of preventing violence or delinquency?
Yeah, well, that's a tough one. Very good one. Because, some school counselors, when schools are open, and that is to say face-to-face schooling is full-blown, school counselors can both monitor incipient signs of violence and in some cases address them effectively. I don't think that can be done as effectively over Zoom, frankly. So I honestly don't know. I'm a criminologist. I'm not a public health expert or researcher. And I would hope that you can refer to public health personnel for more creative ways than I can think of to replace some of those face-to-face contacts that are so important with virtual contacts that I think we'd have to acknowledge might not be quite as effective, but perhaps more effective than doing nothing. So there should be parental hotlines to school personnel and other agency personnel. You know, parents are spending a lot more time at home with their kids. They have the opportunity to observe their kids in close quarters. If they see troubling signs, those hotlines should be used to contact relevant personnel. Now, what happens after that will depend on social distancing requirements and preferences. But there's where a virtual meeting could be certainly more effective than doing nothing at all. That's a great question. I wish I had the relevant expertise to answer it in greater detail.
And then I have one last question. So you co-authored a book with UAlbany's own Steve Messner. And in that book, you argue that the economy as an institution, it often comes to overshadow other social institutions such as education and the family. Mm-hmm. And with that, we should expect to see increasing crime rates. So could you explain this just a bit and perhaps explain how reopening, despite the calls for continued quarantine, might mm-hmm. reinforce this idea?
Yeah, well, in the book Crime and the American Dream, Steve Messner and I made the argument that one of the reasons for the relatively high rates of crime we see in the United States has to do with what we referred to as an institutional imbalance, whereby the free market economy really dominates other institutions. I'm giving you the nutshell version of this rather complicated argument. And for reasons we explain in the book, dominance by the free market economy can lead to high levels of both property and violent crime, serious crime. So how might that argument play out during the current crisis? And while you say, Brian, that it tends to reinforce the argument, I think only to a degree. I think what we've seen is very contested terrain here. Think of the interest representing education as an institution with those representatives of the economy and, quick reopening. I see that as something of a draw, right? And it depends very much on local circumstance, who happens to be the governor and the governor's preferences and so on, and as well as school personnel preferences. I see the same thing with respect to the economy and the political system, right? I guess what I'm saying is the forces at work, and let's call them the public health forces at work, that caution us against reopening too soon, caution us against unleashing the economy again too soon. They're not losing the battle. Now, they're not winning it. It's not a total war on either side, but they're not losing it. So I think we've got real contested terrain here. I'm not certain that's what Messner and I would have predicted had someone told us there's an upcoming pandemic. Do you think the economy is going to shut down? I think we would have said, nah, probably not. Good question, though.
Thank you. So Rick, I'd like to thank you on behalf of everyone in attendance here today and the YGI for presenting this important and incredibly timely work on the pandemic, social unrest, and crime trends. And I really hope that our audience members found it as interesting as I did. And before we close, I do just have a few announcements and items I'd like to put on everybody's radar. So the next session of our Lunch and Learn series will be on October 20th. At 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and we will be hosting Dr. Shad Maruna of Queen's University Belfast. He will be presenting his work on youth desistance from crime, and I will put the link to register for that in the chat right now. And November's Lunch and Learn speaker will be Lisa Good of Urban Grief here in Albany, so stay tuned for that announcement as well. And since many kids are now going to school online, the issue of cyberbullying is emerging as a major concern. The first episode of the YJI's new podcast series, Let's Talk About Youth Justice, explores bullying and cyberbullying through a conversation with Dr. Timothy McCuddy, who is an assistant professor at the University of Memphis. That podcast episode can be found on our website. And the YJI just launched a youth engagement initiative called Empowering Youth Voices. The Empowering Youth Voices project seeks to provide youth and young adults with a platform to share their perspectives on COVID-19 and the current racial justice movement in the United States through writing or visual art. The YJI will feature selected submissions in a special issue of our newsletter on the same page, and 3 submissions will be selected as contest winners. More information about this contest can also be found on the homepage of our website. And shortly after we finish here, we will be sending a survey to you all via email. If you have the time, please complete this survey, as it allows you to provide further feedback and questions for us. So this information will be used to improve future webinar sessions, and this survey should take no longer than about 5 minutes. Finally, if you've not already done so, feel free to connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Links to those accounts can be found on our website. And just a reminder that the views expressed here are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views of the YJI. And in closing, I just want to thank you all for taking part in this session of the YJI Lunch and Learn series. We hope that you've gained something from this webinar and you continue to think about the work that Dr. Rosenfeld has presented here today. We also look forward to seeing you at future YJI events and webinars. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great week.